Welcome to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. This is Jay. This is part one of a two-part conversation on Michael Hardt's recent book, Subversive Seventies. Michael Hardt teaches political theory in the literature program at Duke University. He is the co-author with Antonio Negri of the Empire trilogy and most recently, Assembly. He is the co-director with Sandro Mezzadra of the Social Movements Lab. A couple of things I need to say up front. This conversation was recorded in September and initially would have been released in October, but obviously our programming took a quick turn to solidarity work on the Palestinian struggle in light of those events. As I mentioned in the intro to our most recent episode, we will continue to do that solidarity work primarily, though not exclusively, through our YouTube page for a while, just so that we can get some of these other conversations we recorded prior to October 7th on the podcast feed. Nonetheless, this conversation and the book and the problems it poses, I think, are as interesting and relevant today as they were in September. I mostly date the recording for two reasons. One, it would be quite glaring that we don't talk at all about recent events in Palestine in the conversation. The second reason I mention the date is that in the intervening months, Michael Hardt's longtime collaborator, Antonio Negri, passed away. Negri, of course, was a very serious and renowned political theorist, a militant organizer, and at one point a political prisoner in his own right for his own political activities, coming out of some of the very movements that Michael Hardt discusses in this book. May he rest in peace, and our condolences to Michael for the loss of his friend and collaborator. As I said up front, this discussion is about Michael Hardt's book, Subversive Seventies, which was one of the more interesting books we read last year on the podcast, and we would definitely recommend it, both for its value as a historical document, as well as the theoretical work that Hardt is engaged in the text. As is laid out quite well, I think, on the publisher's website, it is a book that attempts to reconstruct the history of revolutionary politics in the 1970s, to systematically approach political movements of the 70s within a global framework of analysis, and to bring together a wide range of political movements from the decade, highlighting the ways movements in different countries resonated with and were inspired by one another. Part 2 of the conversation we will release in the coming week. I would also be remiss if I didn't say rest in power to Sekou Odinga, who passed away earlier this week. We hope to be able to do more in honor of him and as a tribute to his legacy in the coming weeks and years. Being able to interview him back in 2020, I know, was a highlight of doing this podcast for both Josh and myself. If you appreciate the work we do, our work is only possible through the support of our patrons. You can support our show for as little as $1 a month or $10.80 per year at patreon.com/millennialsarekillingcapitalism. Now here is our interview with Michael Hardt on his book, Subversive Seventies. Michael Hardt, welcome to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. We're excited to have you on. Really enjoyed reading this book. We're here to discuss your brand new book, which just came out, Subversive Seventies. Before we get into discussion, do you mind framing for our audience kind of what you sought to do with this book, and in particular, why the 1970s? As you kind of mentioned in the introduction, this is often a period that people think of as a kind of decline of revolutionary activity or a quote-unquote dark period, but you argue that framing doesn't really help us understand the period very well. So yeah, just say a little about why this book and what the 70s have to offer for those of us on the left today.
I found it inevitable when writing about revolutionary movements in the 1970s to confront the 1970s with the 1960s. I mean, at least as a framing. I didn't want to do this for an entire book. But just because people assume that, and it's sort of ingrained in a certain cultural memory, that the 1960s were the period of revolutionary activity in the US, of course, but also in Czechoslovakia and Mexico, Japan, etc. And I do, of course, recognize, I think the 60s are an important movement of revolutionary activity and important transformations. But my general argument is that the 70s are more relevant for today, in part because they are the beginning of our era. And that the 60s, while super important, really belong to the past. The way that has to get worked out in the course of the book is really about the political questions that the revolutionary movements were asking. And what makes it part of our era, at least in this sense, is that the political questions that they're developing, and even the political questions that they're dismissing are exactly the ones that are relevant for us. And I think we'll get into that a little bit later. But another way maybe that's introductory that could help people situate this is that I think some of the ways in which the revolutionary movements of the 1970s are denigrated in a kind of standard memory are exactly, for me, the positive aspects of them that you have to see from a different perspective. For instance, just one limited example among others, which is that there's a standard narrative that in the 1970s, everything fell apart, that there was a fragmentation of the movements, that the unity that supposedly had existed in the 1960s was destroyed. And of course, what they mean by destroyed by this is that feminists broke with male-led movements, that people of color broke with the white leadership of movements. And that's what's meant by this kind of fragmentation. And that's exactly what, I mean, it's true, of course, that from a certain perspective. But I think that that supposed weakness is really a strength. You know, that the movements of the 70s is when was confronted as a real political problem, the question of multiplicity. I mean, that so, you know, rather than seeing, of course, this kind of fragmentation as a problem, it's posing what was wrong with the supposed unity previously, you know, the kind of hierarchies in which the unity was organized. But then I think unity becomes a false problem. The real problem, I would say, is the modes of articulation among different revolutionary movements, which are, of course, intrinsically tied or interwoven. Like, in what ways feminist movements and anti-racist movements and queer movements and anti-capitalist movements are relatively distinct and are more or less on the same political footing, and nonetheless are able to articulate with one another and struggle. Like, that seems to be a real problem. It's only I mean, maybe that's just a for instance, but I think this is one thing that could give you the flavor of why I think the revolutionary movements of the 70s are more important for us and remain important for us. And maybe I say just one last thing about that, which is another thing that struck me in what I was thinking during the book, because of course, in the book, I'm recounting a lot of things that happened in the 1970s and the organization of groups, etc. But in my mind, through the whole thing is, what does this mean for us today? And I would say that there are two ways I've found myself approaching it. On the one hand, this is for me the less interesting one, that we can see the seeds or the embryo, or I hate those reproductive metaphors, you know, like, I don't know, the beginnings of forms of organizing that have been developed more today. I don't know, the construction of affinity groups or various forms of democratic assemblies. We can see their beginnings then, and they've developed further in what we know today. More interesting, though, is the opposite one, which is really, I think in many respects, the movements of the 70s are way ahead of us, and we have to find a way to catch up to them. That's what I found most exciting about working through and engaging with these movements in the 1970s.
Yeah, you talk about this strategic blindness, and there's an interesting way, I think, that the 70s, you know, they're not legible, right, to like the mainstream. It's not as easy for, you know, PBS to make a documentary that's talking about, like, you know, the civil rights movement, where they show certain things and have a certain kind of bent to the whole thing. That's more difficult in the 70s because there's like a way that the state can only sort of criminalize, like the ruling class can only sort of criminalize these movements. Rather, they're dangerous, I guess, is what I would say in a certain way. Does that make sense?
It totally does. I do think there are two aspects to the danger question. You know, one is that I think within the mainstream image of the 60s, the mainstream image of the 60s is in many ways sanitized. You know, it gives us the dignified marchers and nonviolent marchers in Selma, or students, or flower power, something like that, something that's non-threatening, when of course that's filtering out a lot of what was going on in the 60s. But it's definitely true, nonetheless, that revolutionary movements in the 1970s were much more complicated, you know, were much more ambivalent, and that there's a messiness to it and difficulty, which has to do in some ways with the situation of violence and repression and the question of how to deal with the violence in which they stood, but also the difficulties of negotiating the real landscape of how is it that we can, you know, how is it that one can form a feminist project that is also an anti-racist project? How can you negotiate that? And there's all kinds of messiness involved in that. So there's I guess I'm trying to put together in a way. One is the question about danger, and the danger largely comes to, in my mind, in response, like you were suggesting, to various forms of state and fascist repression in different countries. And the other one is a kind of difficulties or ambivalences in organization, which I think are posed in much more complex ways and solicit a kind of ambivalence. I mean, I think it being troubling, so what many would say, I think rightly, many authors who try to engage the revolutionary movements in the 70s come away saying that they're troubling the movements. And I think that's great. I think that troubling is, I read it as a way of saying that those movements were grappling with real organizational political difficulties, and they hadn't resolved them. I mean, but for me, resolving, it's not that I look to these movements because they've solved all the problems. I would say I look to these movements because they posed real problems, real political problems, and that's a different matter.
Right. Yeah, and I will probably get to that later in the text, but I appreciated that kind of distinction of, rather than having answers, like posing a good problem, understanding a problem well and posing it well. So getting into the text a little bit, after the introduction, you begin your investigation of movements in this book with the liberation struggle of the PAIGC in Guinea-Bissau. As an aside, like, this is one of our favorite movements to study on this podcast. We've done a number of episodes on it. But you also here are discussing struggles, you discuss this in kind of a broader sense, looking at Angola and Mozambique as well, and their struggle against Portuguese colonialism in the same period. And then later you get to Portugal, which we'll get to that later on. But I appreciated your discussion in this section of Trotsky's theory of uneven and combined development and the idea of political voids. I think here you were kind of drawing from Basil Davidson's descriptions of the struggles in Guinea-Bissau. But you write, without the possibility of copying European political institutions or reviving traditional African forms of authority, the PAIGC sought to invent new social relations and political institutions, filling the void left by the colonizers with revolutionary democracy and popular power, end quote. We would love it if you would just talk a little bit about this idea of voids and of a kind of revolutionary orientation to them. And, you talk about this in a couple contexts, although it's very different. It's something that comes up in the next chapter in your discussion of the gay liberation movement in the U.S. in the 1970s, that relationship between a void and revolutionary possibilities with regard to social relations. So yeah, just I know those are very different contexts, but you do kind of talk about them in the same section. So yeah, if you could just talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, one thing I love about you're right that this Basil Davidson was very helpful for giving concrete explanations from inside the revolutionary struggle. One of the phrases he used that I love is that he said, the Portuguese as colonizers left no furniture laying about, which is a lovely way of saying this kind of void that you're talking about. So that by the 1970s, of course, we should remember, the African colonies of the British and the French had already achieved independence. It was really only the Portuguese that were struggling against the European colonizer. And the difference that's being noted here is that in many ways, the French and the British colonizers, like Davidson said, they left furniture lying about. They left certain institutional forms that then the independent country rehabilitated and redeveloped. Think about India after independence, maintaining many of the legal structures of the Raj or other forms. And so what he's saying is different in what the other, the revolutionary participants too, are saying different about the Portuguese regime. And in part because of Portugal being a fascist state, that it doesn't have the kind of liberal democratic structures that then could be used and provide either a kind of convenience, you'd say, for the independent nation to just rehabilitate in different forms these liberal democratic structures, or as a kind of inertia that would maintain. So anyway, like you said, I think this is, was presented as not a disadvantage, but an advantage of having a kind of political void. Yeah, so to understand that, as you said, I found a kind of correspondence with Trotsky's economic notion when he says that seemingly backward economies, he's talking there about the US and Germany with respect to Britain and France, they had actually an advantage because the sectors of the economy were not so encrusted with all of these developed elements, so that there could be a kind of leap of the, and this is part of the uneven development, a leap of these seemingly backward economies that would leap over the developed ones because they had this kind of economic void or void of economic structures. And that allows for innovation. Maybe that's the key here. It's the possibility of, in Trotsky's case, an economic innovation. But here, thinking about Guinea-Bissau, about the 3 Portuguese colonies, they thought of it as a possibility for political innovation. And that's what, lacking the inertia of liberal democratic institutions. This feeds into directly, trying to understand what Amílcar Cabral and the others in this struggle, but Cabral's, I think, the most eloquent one of trying to posit a notion of revolutionary democracy, by which he means, of course, it starts from the assumption that what they're selling us as democracy is not democracy at all. And so it's not a matter of anti-colonial independence to achieve the democratic forms that Europe is presenting to us, but rather inventing democracy anew and actually a sort of real democracy, as more recent struggles would say. And that's possible. This is what I'm trying to say here. That's possible because of the freedom from the inertia of those liberal democratic institutions that pre-existed it. So one last thing in what you asked, which I too saw in writing this, a kind of analogy there. And I'm thinking about Michel Foucault's description of gay liberation and what that would mean. And I'm fascinated by, there's one text that many people have been fascinated by, an interview in Le Gay Pied about homosexuality as a form of life is what people take out of it. But in that, what he says, maybe I'd need to give a little bit of a background, just the basic thing, which is that he says, the actual sex acts is not what really disturbs the normalized heteronormative society. That can be, for them, incorporated, or even the notion of beauty, he says, etc. What really can't be incorporated by the heteronormative society and what really represents something new are, he says, a homosexual mode of life. And what he gives is this list, which I thought was really wonderful, where he talks about the affection and tenderness and friendship and fidelity and camaraderie and companionship of the gay community. It's that poses something qualitatively different. Yeah, so here, you might say when you read that list, well, okay, heteronormative societies always had notions of affection and tenderness and fidelity, etc., friendship, etc. But what he's saying is that there's something qualitatively different, like that the gay community develops a qualitatively different mode of interaction. And I guess I could talk more about the content of that. But here too, I think it's because, in Foucault's thinking this too, of this lack of inertia. Like there's the ability of a kind of leap forward, even in Trotsky's sense, with the economy, here now in a affective sense of creating a new sensorium, like that the homosexual mode of life, and Foucault's proposing it not as just as something great. I mean, it's something great for society as a whole, as a model. And because it's able to create new affective relations, and it's able to do that precisely because it's not burdened with the same regimes of affective relations of heteronormative society. So anyway, all of these, I mean, I feel like I've given all of 3 separate ones, the Trotsky economic one, the Cabral political one, and Foucault's political affective one. I think all of them, like you're saying, are kind of predicated on a certain void or lack of inertia. Or I love the thing, like having no furniture laying around from the previous residents, that allowing the possibility of innovation. The end focuses on innovation, creating new social relations. And in all 3 of these cases, there's kind of a correspondence about where the opportunity for that innovation lies.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think, it's important to contextualize that within the 70s, right? It's like, this is before some of the movement around gay rights and marriage equality and some of those things that might produce more normative, quote unquote, relations that reflect more of the dominant society.
Yeah, more furniture, right, to to clutter up the place.
Right.
Yeah, and furniture from the old regime. That's what the right. I mean, I think you're right that this would be, it's a complex discussion that merits, more working through. But posing what we're reading here in Foucault and his interpretation of what's going on in gay liberation movements in the 1970s, together with the demand for marriage equality, could be an interesting contrast.
Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely. One of the very interesting chapters in this book is your examination of liberation theology, which looks at Nicaragua and Iran. In each context, there's a Marxist current that is infused into religious movements, Islam in Iran and the Jesuits in Nicaragua as well. You recall that through an engagement with Foucault's work that this has also happened numerous times in the past, maybe not always with Marxism, but with revolutionary thought and practice, as you write. And I'm quoting here, theology and religious practices have served as idioms of revolutionary struggle and media of popular mobilization, end quote. So there's also an argument that Foucault makes here about political spirituality being something that is, and I'm quoting here again, an essential characteristic of modern revolutionary movements in general, including the Bolsheviks, end quote. And so also, I would note that you also cite a gap in Foucault's analysis, arguing that he does not accurately analyze the amount of Marxist or communist activity and revolutionary movements. And you further argue that Marxists and religious were intermeshed in Iran and Nicaragua, and this was a key part of their dynamic. So can you say anything here about the conditions that you see as enabling this and this interplay between collective, subjective, and structural transformation in these movements?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I guess I start from this is maybe the less interesting part of it, but after a while I started wondering why I hadn't, and I could say maybe we haven't in general, thought about the Nicaraguan and Iranian revolutions together. I mean, they're both opposing an authoritarian regime put in place by the U.S. and defended by the U.S. They're both working an anti-colonial, anti-imperialist framework. And this then gets to the meat of what I was trying to work with. In both of them, the communist and theological modes of organizing and communities are totally intermeshed. I mean, it's complicated in both instances, and of course it's different. In one case is Islam, in the other case is Christianity or Catholicism mostly, but that doesn't seem to me, I'm interested in that correspondence and the way that they're working together, where the theological and the Marxist frameworks and militants are working together. But that's just at the historical factual level. What really interests me here is about the question of the transformation of subjectivity. Like the recognition, I would say this in general terms, and then coming back to this theological context with these two. I mean, I would say in general, revolution is not simply a matter of transforming social structures while preserving subjectivities. It's not as if the revolutionary societies can be the one in which you finally feel at home. No, I think in order to live in a revolutionary society, we also must be changed. I mean, we have to be transformed. And so part of the revolutionary process seems to me, maybe I'm saying something obvious, maybe not, is that there has to be a subjective transformation that goes along with the social transformation. And that, there are many different idioms that discussion's made in. I can think of the way Mao Zedong says something similar, but in a totally different idiom. But here, I think that this religion or theological context is one field on which the subjective transformation can be posed. This is what Foucault is trying to get at with the political spirituality, where he says, he tries to destabilize the reader, even in what you referred to, which is, he says, also the Bolsheviks were operating on a kind of political spirituality here, by which he doesn't mean that, they had a quasi-religious notion of Marxism, or that is nothing like that. It means that what they were also interested in was the transformation of subjects. So that here, this is what I read, the theoretical terrain here, both the liberation theology in Nicaragua and the Islamic political traditions in Iran as providing the possibility and the framework for a subjective transformation, that we make ourselves different in the struggle, something like that. that's in a way the opportunity I'm seeing here. I'm also, as you said, like along the way, interested in, somewhat destabilizing certain, what I feel like are received notions about, the theology and, that theology and politics are necessarily at odds. And it's not that I'm saying that political movements always have to be theological, definitely not. But we do have a long tradition of theological revolutionary mixtures, and I don't see any reason to exclude theological elements from revolutionary contexts. So anyway, that's it. Maybe that's a minor point. I think the major point, or at least for me, the major point was this one about transformation of political subjectivity and the ways that that's something that I'm finding really interesting and inspiring in both the Iranian and Nicaraguan cases.
Yeah, thank you. So one of the strains you analyze in the book are expressions of popular power. One way you look at this is through the contradictions between the Allende government and the Yarur workers, and these ideas of how to develop social property. In Chile, there's an expression that you cite, toma, or take, which might also translate to something like seize in this instance, and you examine these seizures from below. Another context you examine in this section of the book is Portugal during its revolutionary period, which you note, developed in a kind of relationship to the revolutionary movements that we've discussed earlier in Guinea-Bissau, Angola, and Mozambique. In Portugal, you, following the research of others, argue that a revolutionary theory and revolutionary theorists were not necessarily driving those movements from below, but rather the movements expressed a revolutionary theory through their practice of seizing factories, seizing housing, and directing their activities through local committees. So talk a little bit about the activity in these settings that you see as having revolutionary expressions and potential that exceeded or were not aligned with forms of political organization that were espoused by the Communist Party at the time, which saw a disciplined party and seizure of state power as kind of the primary initial objectives. I realize these are, again, two different contexts, each with their own nuances and particularities, but can you share a bit about the revolutionary expressions you're examining in these two chapters?
Yeah, I think you're right to locate this around the concept of popular power, which was very widespread, both in the Chilean revolutionary experience, from Allende's election in 1970 to the coup in 1973, and then the Portuguese revolutionary experience from 74 to 76. And in both cases, it does seem helpful to me to call these revolutionary processes or something like that, because it's not as if as if all changed on the day of the overthrow of the previous government, either Allende's election or the destruction of the fascist government in Portugal. It was rather a development during a sequence of years that was then ended by right-wing reaction, in each case. And that development, now I'm getting to the crux of the matter with popular power, it went in both these countries often under, all the groups said we're developing popular power. That was sort of widespread. But at least one way of dividing them that's helpful for me is, you could say in shorthand, popular power from above and popular power from below, but that doesn't seem quite sufficient to me. I guess it's something like that, though, in the way that there's one version that has a notion of the representation of the people that's then supported by popular power, so that the Allende government itself, functions this way. And even also in some of the opposition to, let's say, distinct groups from Allende that supported the government, like the MIR, the Revolutionary Left Movement in Chile, that they understood and they practiced popular power as a representation of the people and of a popular support of it. But then there were other movements, often allied to, I'm not talking about a necessarily or always antagonistic distinction, of popular groups that develop popular power by decentralized decision-making without reference to those so-called representatives. You could divide maybe popular power of representation and popular power of participation. You could put it that way. And so you mentioned one case that I found very interesting of this Yarur. It's a cotton factory in Santiago. And also you said, which was helpful in what you're introducing, like using the work of others. Absolutely. Like I'm no historian. I'm reading historians. So I'm, using their work. And I found super useful this one case about a factory that was, seized by the workers and then self-managed by the workers. So the seizure of factories was part of the agenda of the Allende regime, and the nationalization of them was part of the agenda. But they wanted to control it at a certain pace in negotiation with the bourgeoisie, et cetera, to do it what they considered at the right rhythm. The workers instead, and in this particular case, they occupied and took over the factory on their own. They made their own decision. And Allende was furious about it, and the government was in conflict. So here we had one example of, I would say, facing each other, two notions of popular power, one that is organized by autonomous committees of the workers themselves, and another notion of popular power, which is representing the interests of the workers. So this is what its government and the union was claiming to do, representing their interests, but claiming decision-making or reserving decision-making in a centralized structure for themselves. This seems to me, just when I'm reading through the revolutionary process in both countries, at least a tension or a political alternative that carries forward for me. And I find interesting. One last thing that you mentioned, because you put a lot into these questions that I wanted to bring together. I think it's a very similar or analogous situation with the question of property. So factory seizures is a question of property. You also mentioned, say, in Portugal, housing, the seizure of housing and occupation of housing or the seizure of land. These are the kind of things that these committees or commissions, in Portugal did. But there are two ways of doing that, of conceiving property. Like both of those are violations of private property. The seizing the factory, seizing the housing, seizing the land, etc. These are obviously anti-private property. But the one, which corresponds, I guess, to my popular power from above, then sees the resulting, all of them call it social property, as something that is in some ways administered by the state. So the factory would be nationalized, and then under the control of the state. Whereas other factors in the movement, the one I'm identifying with this popular power from below, they saw social power, which was against private property, as something that's not property at all, that I would call the common, that is where what was formerly property is distributed and decisions made about it by the committees of those who are distributing. So there, for instance, in Portugal, there were so-called neighborhood committees that made decisions about and administered the housing that was seized. This seems to me qualitatively different. And so we have two different notions of what the destruction of private property will look like. One of it will look like public property, state property or state-administered property, public property in that sense. And the other would be something that seems to me not property at all. In all of these, I feel like I might be going into too much detail with this, although you too have very much patience for detail of these things. But just stepping back a moment, what I'm trying to do is recognize alternatives, sometimes tensions in the historical thing, but also alternatives for us in revolutionary projects. And it seems to me that here I'm trying to identify a kind of cleavage which poses a political alternative for us, two modes of a revolutionary process.
Appreciate that, and no worries about. Feel free to go into as much depth as you like.
Yeah, absolutely. So you write about how worker struggles in this period often express themselves in autonomous form as unions began to be seen as part of the problem in this period for their inability to produce greater democracy or self-management within the industrial settings, and for their inability to address desires for a greater quality of life beyond mere struggles of wages and benefits. In other words, workers organized beyond the union structure due to limits of the unions, at least in this context, as vehicles of transformation. And among the great sources you use, you draw on two of our favorite texts in the section, Detroit, I Do Mind Dying, and The Ungovernable Society. You talk about this in the section, how the 70s are often in the U.S. understood as a period of crisis. But this period is often described in terms of economic crisis, when, as you know, the even greater crisis was perhaps the political one. So can you say a little bit about the political crisis of the 1970s and how these autonomous worker movements sought to transform power relations. And ultimately, you see in this section a reorientation that is necessary on behalf of workers that you write, and I'm quoting here again, "We are still yet to fully resolve today," end quote. So could you expand on some of these reflections?
Yeah, that's great. And let's maybe stick for a moment with industrial struggles within the U.S., because I think they're resonant in many other countries, but somewhat different. I mean, the first thing I want to insist on that seems to me often underappreciated is how radical and powerful and successful were industrial worker movements in the U.S. in the early 1970s. It was a period of extraordinary worker unrest, extremely powerful and widespread strikes, and radical organizing. I mean, so it's both. I think both the radicality of it, and I'll get to in a minute what I mean by that, I suppose, and the success of it. That they really endangered the industrial matrix, the industrial society, and they did this by, or at least I frame it, or I think of it in terms of a double refusal, in which you already mentioned, Wei. And so in part, and in large part, maybe it's the basis of it, is a refusal of industrial discipline. And I would put this under the rubric of the refusal of work. A concept would need some explanation. So it's not a refusal of productivity in some general way. It's a refusal of the situation in which they work and the authority under which they work. And like I say, the industrial disciplinary regime. These are workers that hated the factory. They hated the factory for good reason, because the factory regime and the factory discipline, was hateful. Not meaning they wanted to go somewhere else. They wanted to fight there in the factory against factory discipline. So that was the first refusal. But the second refusal is against the existing and dominant union structure. So this was not an anti-union sentiment. This was not against collective bargaining. It was rather demands for democratic organizing structures, for a new union. Yeah, so think about, because you referenced it even with reference to that book, that great book, Detroit, I Do Mind Dying. Think about the League of Revolutionary Black Workers in Detroit, in the auto industry. They were against, they were fighting against the UAW, fighting within and against the UAW for its corruption, for its racism, for its centralized decision-making. And what they were demanding was new forms of collective organization of industrial workers. Yet with the idea, this is part of it too, that when we say democratic organizing, what we mean is that workers are capable of representing themselves. It doesn't mean that you don't have to have some sort of organizational structure, but it means that you don't have to have a union structure that decides for the workers. And so anyway, I would just put this in, I think it's sometimes misunderstood when one talks about the antagonism of workers to the unions in this time, that people would say, oh, well, they're just somehow anti-union. That's not at all true. It's rather about a different kind of organizing. So anyway, come to this double refusal. Like I said, a refusal of industrial workers of the industrial discipline, the factory, of the speed up, of the kinds of life that it creates for them, and the refusal of the traditional and existing and centralized union structure. It's this double refusal. It's this radical forms of worker organizing that threaten to make factories ungovernable, and that this is what management reacted to. Management had to, and this is, when you mentioned that book by Shemayu, The Ungovernable Society, he goes into great detail reading management actors, and theorists of the time in the 1970s, that they were scared. They were scared about the ungovernability of the factories and the ways that the ungovernable factories would make an ungovernable society. That's what he was thinking. And they reacted to it by, this is really you were saying, the tragedy of the 1970s in a collective memory of the worker rebellion. They reacted to it by effectively destroying the bases of industrial worker power, by a restructuring of the U.S. industrial system, through automation, through exporting production to other countries, moving it in the United States to states where collective bargaining is less powerful, etc. They did that successfully. So in that sense, you could say, yes, the 70s were a tragedy for U.S. labor in the sense that management and capital were able to restructure the system such that the industrial base was transformed. And the basis, this is the more important thing, the basis for worker rebellion was transformed. But I would say, that, the defeat in that, and maybe this is something we can get to later, the fact that workers' struggles, as they were formed in the early 1970s, were in essence defeated. Defeat doesn't exactly bother me here. I think we have to recognize what was actually going on and what was important and useful about it. Like you point out, I say at a certain point, apparently still yet to be resolved, like that we haven't yet worked through the problems that they were seizing. In one part, this double refusal, the refusal of work and the refusal of corporate union representation, that's true. But I think there's another aspect. So that's one avenue that we could continue talking about, and maybe we'll get to in the further things, which is how can we think about today's both successes and frameworks of labor organization in relationship to these ones in the early 1970s. And maybe we could even use that optic I said a little bit earlier, like in what sense are we inheriting and developing the aspects that were begun then, but in what ways do we really need to catch up to then? Like, were they really ahead of us? So that's one aspect, sticking within the labor thing. But there's a separate one, and maybe we're going to get to this, I think, a little bit later, which is that the destruction of the bases of industrial labor organizing, or the attack on it, let's say, by the restructuring of industrial production in the United States, this transformation of factories, that also posed different conditions within revolutionary movements in the United States. It effectively destabilized a figure of organization that had a relatively widespread purchase, which posed the industrial worker at the head of revolutionary activity. And that's something I think that U.S. labor failed to react to in the 1970s. How could it transform in such a way by not only recognizing, but actually taking advantage of the opportunity that destabilized a notion of political organization whereby the industrial worker was at its core? Like, I think maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but I'll just pose this and then we can come back as we go further. I think it was a failure of the organization of revolutionary movements that it maintained as long as the 1970s, some of, or many of them, a notion of the centrality of industrial worker as a figure of revolutionary movement, as if other movements should see this as its representative or strongest force or something like that. And so I think that the destruction of that position provided an opportunity for rethinking what revolutionary movement should be and the position of industrial labor and industrial labor role within that.
Yeah, we will get to that for sure. But I appreciate that because I think it is an important aspect that you're pulling out in that section. I just want to offer a couple of comments too to our listeners too. I mean, one was, this statistic always stands out to me. It's in Detroit, I Do Mind Dying. It's in this book as well, is that just for context, in 1970, the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health estimated 65 on-the-job deaths per day in U.S. auto plants, about half of those from heart attacks, in contrast to the average of 17 U.S. military deaths per day in Vietnam in 1970. And, I think that gives folks context also of like how deadly not only that kind of work and disciplinary regime was, but also why workers were organizing against speed ups. And interestingly, I mean, I think thinking about the union context in that time, and there's a whole broader discussion we could have about unions, but is that they were very conservative in this period compared to the workers in terms of trying to kind of maintain discipline and basically a kind of managerial regime of their own, maybe coming out of kind of the historical compromise between labor and capital and kind of the high tide earlier on. I don't know. And interestingly, I think just to bring it current, like UAW's current leadership is making more radical demands now in their current strike of saying, hey, we want to reduce the work week to 32 hours a week from 40. We want to, have agreements built in where you can't just relocate plants without, the union, it's part of our contract that you can't just relocate our plants. And so it's interesting because I think, and then we could talk about the unionization of like Starbucks baristas and things like that, of maybe we're in a moment where union activity is starting to recognize some of these issues that were really, happening in the 1970s and is responding differently. Obviously, that is too soon to say, but there's certainly a renewed climate of worker militancy, which, we want to support here. So kind of along that topic, but in a different context, you write about the Autonomia movement and that one of its achievements was that it was, quote, able to move out of the factory and into society, recognizing that the end of the centrality of the industrial worker did not mean the end of class struggle, but instead called for its transformation and renewal. The need for such a reorientation of class struggle had long been present, but it became particularly urgent when, in the course of the 70s, the processes of deindustrialization, automation, and outsourcing of manufacturing eroded the position of the industrial working class, which is what you're kind of just discussing there. The Autonomia movement's attempts to recast working class struggles by taking account of multiple figures of labor, including waged and unwaged work, the precariously employed and unemployed, reproductive labor, service work, and so forth, and by seeking to organize them in new, more democratic network forms were a significant advance, even if in Italy, too, their efforts were only partially successful, end quote. So, yeah, talk in particular about some of the areas that you see as the kind of theoretical advances of the Autonomia movement expressed through their actions, through their practice in the 1970s.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I do think that there is a contrast that I'm posing between the reaction in the industrial workers movement in Italy and the one in the US in the mid-1970s to the same phenomenon, which is in both countries, there was a attack by capital on working class organizing, industrial working class organizing in particular, through a restructuring like we've just been talking about, by relocating plants, by automation, by a number of different factors. And what interests me in Italy is an attempt in these years, and like I said, with some success or posing some possibilities, but not completely realized for a variety of reasons, of reorienting class struggle in a wider frame, in both senses, destabilizing the previous centrality of the industrial worker. So on the one hand, within class struggle, thinking about a variety of forms of work that are, in some sense, have to be equally accounted for. So that it's not just that industrial labor is the leading force and all other forms of labor follow behind it. But then on another axis, there's a relationship between class struggle and feminist struggle and anti-racist struggle and queer struggle. There has to be, so there's a decentralization of the figure of the industrial worker as the revolutionary figure in a separate sense. And so I think that these are two contexts where a process of political articulation is necessary, of recognizing the ways that class struggle can be configured through a variety of laboring figures, and that can be even represented in collective organizing, of labor. And then class struggle in relationship to other liberation struggles, how to do this. Like I say, in Italy, I find, and specifically in this movement Autonomia, I see the demands and the attempts for that, and then also recognizing in this context the obstacles it ran into. I mean, just to be very brief about it, you could say there were two kinds of obstacles. Maybe one, which is, the difficulty with the militants themselves, that the male militants who had been both factory workers and ones working in the factories had a certain, let's say, difficulty in this transformation. Feminism did not come easily to many of them. So there was that internal obstacles, but there was also, and more importantly, external obstacles. This was just the years of incredible state and fascist repression of the movements. And so it's almost unimaginable that such an experiment could be successful to be conducted in such a situation of violence and repression. both for violence and repression, like you were mentioning earlier, like the U.S. context, the violence in the factories was extreme, both from the work itself, but also from strike breakers, from the police, etc. I mean, many were saying at the time that factories were in a state of war, a state of civil war, workers arming themselves in the factories, etc. But then also repression of the movements in a more general sense, fascist terrorism, state repression, collaboration between the state and fascist groups. I mean, a state of civil war in a more general sense. So that even when I find inspiring such a attempt, to move beyond the industrial paradigm of revolutionary organizing in Italy, which had been super prominent, up until the early 1970s, one can understand easily how it could have difficulty succeeding in such a violent context.
Yeah, absolutely. So in part 4 of your book, you look at strategic multiplicities, both in terms of radical feminist articulations around capitalist patriarchy, the work of the Combi River Collective, principles of articulation, and so on. This section of the book focuses heavily on the theoretical work of radical feminists, Marxist feminists, and Black feminists in the 70s. In the second chapter in the section looks at concepts of racial identity and multiplicity coming out of student movements, among others. Concepts like third world, people of color, and political blackness, particularly in the UK and South Africa. And you write at the end of the section, and I'm quoting here, a strategic multiplicity is not a mere collection of identities. It is at once internally heterogeneous and composed by a range of diverse singular elements with, in principle, with no priority among them in a coherent whole, capable of decision-making and effective common action, end quote. So I realize there's a lot to this section of the book, and we're asking you to summarize this part, which is about many different things. But maybe you could say, you can ground your discussion of this discussion through this concept of strategic multiplicities. Help us understand what this is and how it relates to these feminist theorizations and racial multiplicities you're examining in this section.
Yeah, this is, in fact, the part of the book that's most U.S. oriented. Of course, in the book, I was trying to be, to treat as much of revolutionary movements in different parts of the world as I could, given my own limitations of knowledges and language. But here, the U.S. seemed primary. And as you're suggesting, too, this question of multiplicity and articulation, I think, is most well advanced on feminist terrain. And that's something that'd be interesting to explore, why, in what ways feminist organizing and feminist theorizing is able to understand multiplicity better than in other terrains of struggle. But I'll leave that aside for a moment. I think that's a super interesting thing to develop. What I mean by this, maybe I should start back from, you mentioned that I was in part reading socialist feminist understandings of capitalist patriarchy in the early 1970s. And I was thinking in particular with what you mentioned of an essay by Iris Young, in which she's talking about, both two sides of it, let's say, the one side, which is the relationship between the two structures of power, capital and patriarchy. And on the other side, and maybe this is really the standpoint from which we're making this discussion, is what are the possibilities and needs for the articulation between an anti-capitalist movement and a feminist movement. And there's one principle that she poses that I find super useful, where she says that we cannot think these until we understand them on equal footing. And like equal footing, I'm not sure so that we can't think of capital as having priority, more important than the social structures of patriarchy or the social structures of white supremacy, etc. And similarly, in movement organizing, we can't say, oh, well, the capitalist, the anti-capitalist movement is primary, feminist movement, okay, it's important, anti-movement, yeah, it's important, but we'll call it the woman question or the race question, have them as secondary. Instead, we have to see, she says, on equal footing. My only hesitation is that notion of equal, because I think one leads down the wrong road when one tries to think about this in quantitative terms. Like what would be equal? Can we measure the suffering caused by capital and the suffering that's caused by patriarchy and declare them equal in some sense? I think the question of measure leads one down the wrong track. I think instead what she means, and the way I think it has to be adopted, is in the sense that there's no priority, that there's no priority between one or the other. Thinking of this in qualitative terms. And moreover, that it's not an empirical study that can lead us to this, is that we can say, oh, well, we study capital and decide that it is equal to patriarchy in some sense. No, it's a strategic political decision. This is what I mean by strategic multiplicities, that we have to understand, create strategically the conditions whereby an anti-capitalist struggle and a feminist struggle and an anti-racist struggle and a queer struggle and not have priority among them. Like that's constructed strategically. That's what I wanted to say. Also, for listeners, if I'm sure this sounds familiar because, in many ways, an aspect of the very complicated field of what's come to be called intersectionality was being worked out in many of these ways, or you could say this is a kind of precursors for thinking intersectionality. Intersectionality, of course, specifically from the perspective of the struggles, that it's not just thinking about the interwoven nature of the structures of power, but also the possibilities of articulation among those movements. And like I was just saying, in order for, and I'm calling that a multiplicity, that say a liberation movement that is at once anti-capitalist or that manages to articulate anti-capitalist, feminist, queer, and anti-racist and anti-ableist and other structures, that's a multiplicity because of the possibility of articulation internal. And one of a key principle that makes a multiplicity possible, I'm taking here, is this notion of the lack of priority created as a strategic condition within the organizing structure. I hope that makes sense. Yeah, so let me give you an example, because you also mentioned it's a slightly different optic on this question about multiplicities. Thinking about multiracial groups or groups struggling for a multiracial democratic order, something like that. So one of them I consider is a very well-known one, which is the Third World Liberation Front that was formed at San Francisco State College in 1968. Also had similarly named or exactly the same named ones in Berkeley, at City College in New York, et cetera. And what these were a strike group, a union of student groups that formed together in order to conduct a strike at the college. And so at San Francisco State, there were 5 such student groups. There's the Black Student Union, there was a Mexican student group, a Latin American student group, a Chinese student group, a Filipino student group. I think I have them right, but you get the idea, that there were different racially organized student groups that functioned together under the rubric of third world. And in fact, the notion third world, what it did for them, it sort of seems odd in retrospect because these are all U.S. students. They're all U.S.ers, they're not from elsewhere. But the notion of third world was, I think, part of the strategic mobilization of the fact that there is no priority among them. So that this, I would say, is functioning as a racial multiplicity, this notion, the Third World Liberation Front. The same way that the Third World Women's Alliance, in a different context did in these same years, or even the way the notion of people of color functioned during these years in many instances. Or even think, now I'm just giving more examples so that listeners can identify with it. I would say that the book, This Bridge Called My Back, is premised on this notion of a racial multiplicity within feminist projects. Okay, so to come back to it, I would say, and maybe it seems obvious to anyone thinking about it, that if you have this articulation among these 5 different student groups in the Third World Liberation Front, if you were to say that there's really a priority of the Black Student Union, the others are junior partners, that would no longer function as a multiplicity. It would destroy the possibility of articulation. And so that's what I'm getting at here. One other example, and you referred to it, and maybe it just gives another optic on the same thing, and gets us out of the U.S., fortunately, which I was thinking about the way that the notion of Blackness functioned within the Black consciousness movement in South Africa. And here I'm taking this from Steve Biko, the best-known leader of the Black consciousness movement. He testified to a court that was actually trying not him, but fellow members of the Black consciousness movement. And they tasked him, these white apartheid judges, which is a bizarre scene. They tasked him with explaining to them what is the Black consciousness movement. And so part of what is explained to him is what Blackness means. And, and the judges are a little bit mystified, I think. But he starts by saying something like, a Black policeman, that's a contradiction in terms. You can't be Black and a policeman. You're no longer Black if you're a policeman. And so people whose skin color is Black are only Black in the Black consciousness movement insofar as they're part of the struggle. But similarly, he says, members of, what they call there the colored community and the South Asian community, they are Black insofar as they're part of the struggle. He says only white South Africans cannot be Black. But interestingly, Black becomes not a question of skin color or really a racial designation. Black becomes a political designation. And so I would say that Black constitutes a political multiplicity in this sense, insofar as the component elements have no priority among them, and that's what is a condition for articulation. Okay, I went a little bit far again on this, but I was just trying the whole time to understand, to explain what I mean. A, what I mean by multiplicity. B, the way that I understand, and it seems quite significant to me, that even in these movements, even when they're not posing it this way, the lack of priority among the different elements is a precondition, a political precondition, a strategic precondition for creating the articulation. And maybe I should bring a third thing here that goes throughout the book that we haven't mentioned so far. It's kind of a, what should I call it? An axiom that I brought to the whole thing, which is that movements, political movements, create concepts. So it's not, I just say it the simple way, it's not like there's a division of labor whereby intellectuals think and activists act. No, in movements, collectively, there is great theoretical work that's done, often in a different idiom, often in a different register, but equally valuable or also valuable. I don't want to measure them exactly this too. And so partly what I'm doing, and this is something that Antonio Negri and I have been, we sort of have been acting along this principle for quite a while, which is to read theoretically the collective work that goes on in movements and to treat that seriously in theoretical terms. So partly, just to come back to this, I'm taking this notion of multiplicities, even when the movements of the time weren't always using that term, or maybe none of them were now that I'm thinking about it. I'm trying to, in some ways, formalize or understand for myself, is the better way of saying it, the kind of theoretical work that the movements are putting forward, and that I'm recognizing is consistent actually in different national contexts and in different even political contexts.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And we will come back a little bit at the end to this question of priority and articulation, because I think it's an important thing to kind of wrestle with, maybe trouble a little bit and dialogue on, but also I think you are pointing to something very important there in terms of that idea of articulation, this idea of, the autonomy of these struggles, but also how do they coalesce together strategically, that point. So, and I'm sure this will also come through in some of these discussions of these other chapters too, but in your chapter, New Alliances Against the State, you talk about encampments in Larzac, France, and I apologize if I mispronounce either of these. One's French and the other one is Japanese, and I don't speak either. So Larzac, France, and Sanrizuka, Japan, which included local residents, activists from outside, and in some cases around the world. I love this section. In some ways, it reminded me of the current struggle in Atlanta around stopping Cop City. And also, I think that concept of strategic multiplicity we could have a whole conversation about that in relation to that struggle. Although these movements you examine here were even larger. At some points you talk about, tens of thousands of people, I think, engaged in some of these activities. So one, I'd love if you talk a little bit about the power of encampments and, maybe a bit of what you think they have the potential to inculcate kind of politically. Encampments continue to be a prominent feature of many of our movements today. You write eloquently about them, not only as defensive structures, which of course they are, but also as, quote, cauldrons of innovation, creating new alliances, transforming the repertoires of political practice, and generating novel social forms, end quote. So yes, maybe just elaborate on this a bit here through discussion of these encampments at Larzac and Sanrizuka.
Very good pronunciation, by the way. And I should start, maybe, I too, like you, I was reading these encampments in relation to encampments, of the last 10, 15 years, which I think is really interesting. So Larzac, this was the one in France, was in a rural area. It was against the expansion of a military base and went on for a long time. These are both of these are decades long struggles. The one in Sanrizuka in Japan, it was to prevent the construction of what's now the Tokyo airport. And that also in a rural area, pretty far outside of Tokyo. And both of them, like you said, involved like the residents of the area and, often agriculturally oriented and, rural residents. And militants from the city, often students, many of them professional militants, who had great experience, veterans, let's say, of other struggles. And so put them together. And that's one of the things that I found most interesting about these encampments is the kind of mutual transformations that went on, living together for years and years in these constructions of the encampments that transformed them politically. In some ways, they adopted, the tactics, the political tactics of each other. Like, for instance, in Japan, the students who came from the city and the other veteran organizers had a lot of experience with fighting with the police. And the rural residents didn't. And there was some resistance, but there was a lot of adopting the tactics of battling the police, often in creating these massive defensive structures, or other means of fighting the cops. I'm interested, maybe this goes back to another mode that we were talking about earlier, when I was posing it in those theological, grounds, like about the transformation of subjectivity. I think that's something also that goes on in encampments in a very interesting way. And that's partly what I was wanting to track in these. So that, maybe that's a way, the way encampments provide a terrain for the transformation of subjectivity. I mean, that's definitely something we saw if you go back to 2011. And think about those urban encampments, so-called movements of squares, both in Tunisia and Egypt, but also in Athens and in Spain, before then Occupy Wall Street, and all of these, and then even then going on to 2013 in Gezi Park in Turkey or even Brazil that year. I mean, we had encampments all over, urban encampments, of things. And I think one thing that was so interesting about those urban encampments is the way that people were transformed by them. You're pointing to, and we could come back to, some of the, I don't want to call them failures, some of the difficulties experienced in encampments of the inability to make the kinds of articulations necessary. I mean, I'm just thinking about a commonplace said, a widely recognized thing about Occupy Wall Street was the difficulty of articulating with feminist and anti-racist struggles, or rather even within the encampment itself, dealing with patriarchal and racist issues. But nonetheless, I think the first thing to think about is about that mutual transformation, which I assume, this is part of what goes in the Cop City encampment. I know a little bit better maybe what has been going on in France in recent years, both about there again an encampment, to try to prevent a mega airport, and then let's call them ecological encampments going on right now. What's interesting also about these rural encampments, both from the 1970s and today, are the relationship to the land too. Standing Rock is an excellent example of that. The way a lot of the militants coming from elsewhere learned a new relationship to the land in addition to a kind of subjective transformation in the struggle. But I think all of them do that one way or another. Both the ones like I'm talking about from Japan and France in the 70s and the ones today necessarily pose both a subjective transformation and a new relationship to the land. In any case, this is the way I would read them. I mean, I guess for me, part of the first recognition is, wow, those encampments of the 70s look so much like what we're doing today. So recognizing that it isn't just, a recent invention, that it has that kind of legacy. But then, as I say, what I'm trying to find more over here is the kinds of negotiations and transformations that happen to those within the encampment by being part of it, by being together. This is something we also thought about in 2011, or I thought about at the time. I guess Tony and I were reflecting on this a lot at the time, which is that being together, of living together in the encampment had itself a transformative power that one doesn't get from the kinds of digital relations that we often have. But even more intense, I would say, in these rural encampments, the face-to-face, the being together, the physical bodies enact a kind of subjective transformation or require a kind of subjective transformation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think they require that you have to articulate with different, because there's usually different movements, different organizations, all of that show up too.
Absolutely. Yeah. And sometimes this is what maybe sometimes that articulation doesn't work. There's nothing immediate about it. But this is coming back to the very beginning of our conversation. I mean, what one thing I want to recognize is that articulation becomes an important political problem for us, and remains an important political problem for us. In some ways, I think that, the job of the kind of political theorizing one can do in a book like this is to recognize real problems. The problems have to be solved actually collectively in practice. So it's not a matter that, like one can write a book and say, oh, I've got the answer, you had it wrong in the movements, here's what you got to do. It doesn't work that way, and it shouldn't work that way. But recognizing real problems, I think that's an important function, something one can strive to.
Yeah, absolutely.